Front rank, kneel, Asinius shouted. The veterans took the command in stride, the legionnaires familiar with the sound of his voice. They stood shoulder to shoulder. "Who are the better legionnaires today?" he roared, slamming his visor down behind them. "Legion 1, my lord," they responded with a cheer before kneeling like a well-oiled machine. Across the landscape, the Baal warriors rode across the plain, their mounts leaping across the dead pooled in the middle of the battlefield. With a loud roar, the lion men crashed into the front line of Legion 1, slaughtering most of the first rank. Asinius heard their screams and the roar of the warriors as he battled for his life. His horse was cut down, and he tumbled from the saddle. One of his men helped him to his feet as a lance burst through his back. The blood splattered across Asinius's face as another legionnaire impaled the warrior. Asinius wiped his face across his sleeve, then attacked, slashed, and hacked limbs from their massive 8-foot frames, ducking, spinning, and slaughtering. 4 fell at his feet before the 2nd Regiment behind sprinted into the mix. A loud horn sounded on his left, then on his right, as the warriors retreated. As they drew back for another charge, Asinius's men hurried to reform. Tiberius rode forward to Asinius's position to see the battle up close, his retainers floating in front of him, shields held high for any stray arrows. "End this now!" Tiberius shouted, sitting in the saddle next to Asinius. Asinius swung his blood and fur-covered blade in front of his face, and then raised his sword above his head. "On me, you bastards!" he commanded, remounting a fresh horse. His men stood up and marched forward to space themselves from the dead. Out of the corner of his eye, Asinius watched several Baal warriors galloping into their flank, buying time for their shield brothers to regroup. Asinius watched as the riders bore down on Tiberius. He pointed his sword at the emperor behind him. "To the emperor!" Asinius slammed his heels into his horse's flanks and rode back to the emperor, followed by 12 of his hardened centurions in red-plumed helmets. He dismounted in front of Tiberius's horse. A broken pike lay in front of him. He snatched it and posted it against the inside of his boot just as the riders slammed into them, their lances aimed low. Asinius heard the roars a few feet away. Before he could blink, the warriors crashed into him and his men. Asinius thrust his spike up and gored the lead rider in the chest. Another rider on his right, with a red rope tied around the tip of his lance, aimed it at him. Asinius's mind raced, then slowed to a crawl as the spearhead floated into his view. The lance penetrated Asinius's armor and slammed into his hip. Before the warrior could slam his spear through him, one of his centurions launched a pilum into the air, tumbling the warrior from the saddle. Asinius ground his teeth and gave a deep growl, then fell into one of his men. He spat the phlegm from his parched throat, then freed his sword. He yanked the broken lance from his hip and screamed in pain. Another warrior closed in, and 3 of his centurions stepped in front of him and engaged. The few warriors fell quickly. Then Asinius collapsed. He stayed conscious long enough to see his fellow leaders, Palladius and Marus Atticus, lead his men forward to slaughter the remaining warriors. Then he passed out. He woke up several hours later in a medical tent, with Tiberius hovering over him. "You're still alive?" Tiberius asked. Asinius nodded and stared at his shattered hip. "I am promoting you to prefect for your sacrifice. You saved my life, and for that, I am grateful. Heal up and then report to the castle for your new assignment," Tiberius said. Asinius could only nod, the pain too great for him to speak. The emperor withdrew with his entourage and left Asinius to revel in his glory.